Good morning. I hope everybody's having a great day so far. My name is Gus Hunt. I'm the Managing Director and Cyber Practice Lead for Accenture Federal Services, and we are very much honored to be opening the Cyber Operations and Sea Services panel that's moderated by Vice Admiral Tighe. I don't know how many of you were able to attend last night's event, but we had a terrific conversation with Admiral Tighe, Admiral Gilday, and Admiral Becker talking about the role of cyber as an instrument of national security. It was an interesting and wide-ranging conversation that talked about everything from the importance of building resilient systems able to take a punch to the shifting rules of men and machines as machine learning and AI begins to take hold and becomes an effective tool to enable us to operate faster and quicker in the cyber domain across the board. We discussed things like the fact that cyber is a very unique weapon system in itself, unmatched in terms of velocity and the pace of innovation, also unmatched by the fact that it actually doesn't really have any rules. The very low cost of entry, there's no Geneva Convention or anything else like that around it that allows us to be able to apply some consistent set of recognized guidelines on any form of international scale across the board. And then we also had this discussion of this massively large and growing cyber surface driven by the Internet of Things and the explosive growth of connected devices across the world. Anyhow, this morning we'll be hearing from our panelists as Admiral Tighe steps into the conversation around focusing on cyber operations and sea services. And so at this, I'm delighted to introduce Admiral Tighe and turn this over to you.
Okay,
so
thanks very much, Gus. And thank all of you for joining us this morning. As you can see, we've assembled quite our top talent among our sea services for cyber. As many of you know, our nation, and specifically our Department of Defense, is inundated daily by malware designed for a wide range of nefarious purposes. Everything from malware that is intended for criminal activity to malware that is intended for espionage, malware that is intended to disrupt operations of a wide range of topics, and even those destructive pieces of malware that's out there. No matter the purpose of the malware that is flying around in cyberspace, these leaders have to deal with it, whether it was specifically aimed at disrupting Navy operations, or it's simply commodity crime malware that is banging on the doors of our DoD networks. And they have to be able to assure the integrity and availability of our networks for the important missions that our service create. They're also charged with wielding cyber effects for our nation that can be used by combatant commanders or our national decision makers during times of conflict or crisis. I'd ask you to please understand, however, that that part of their portfolio is not a topic that we openly discuss in this forum. And so please bear with us on those things that we can't really talk about. It is my pleasure to introduce each of the panelists, after which they'll provide opening remarks, and then we'll have a Q&A section started by me, and then we'll move on to your questions. First of all, we're honored to have Vice Admiral Mike Gilday, who currently serves as the Commander, U.S. Fleet Cyber Command, and the Commander of the 10th Fleet, where he leads operations in signals intelligence, space, and cyberspace. He's a surface warfare officer and a 1985 graduate of the United States Naval Academy, and is a graduate of the Harvard Kennedy School and a distinguished graduate of the National War College. His previous command tours include the USS Higgins, DDG-76, USS Benfold, DDG-65, Carrier Strike Group 8 embarked on USS Dwight D. Eisenhower. His last tour was the J3, Director of Operations for U.S. Cyber Command, and he assumed command of U.S. Fleet Cyber Command, the U.S. 10th Fleet, in July of 2016. Please welcome Admiral Gilday. Next, we have Marine Corps Major General Lori Reynolds, who's the commander of the U.S. Marine Corps Forces Cyberspace Command. She serves in a variety of she has served in a variety of command and staff billets in the operating forces and has had many tours focused on the communications missions. She's also had tours in acquisition, recruiting, and in command control, communications, and computer arenas. Her most recent assignment was the Principal Director, Asia and Pacific in the Office of the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Asia and Pacific. General Reynolds is a graduate of the United States Naval Academy. There tends to be a theme here. She earned a master's degree from the Naval War College and the Army War College. Please welcome Major General Reynolds. Next we have Rear Admiral Tighe White. Admiral White currently serves as the Commander, U.S. Cyber National Mission Force at Fort Meade, Maryland. He's a 1987 graduate of the United States Naval Academy, where he received a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering. He holds a Master of Science in Systems Technology, Command Control and Communications from the Naval Postgraduate School, and a Master of Science in National Resource Strategy from the National Defense University, Industrial College of the Armed Forces. Originally a surface warfare officer, he recovered and was redesignated as a cryptologist in 1993. Please welcome Admiral Tighe White. Finally, we have U.S. Coast Guard Rear Admiral Kevin Lunday, currently serving as the Commander, Coast Guard Cyber Command, and Assistant Commandant for Command Control, Communications, Computers, and Information Technology on the Commandant staff. He's served in a variety of intelligence, legal, and operational assignments in the Coast Guard, including command afloat and ashore. Rear Admiral Lunday is a distinguished graduate of the National War College with a Master of Science in National Security Strategy and a graduate of the Naval War College, College of Command and Staff. He also holds a Juris Doctor from George Washington University Law School and a Bachelor of Science in Marine Engineering from the U.S. Coast Guard Academy. Please welcome Admiral Lunday to the panel. I'm sure you'd agree this is quite a lineup of talent, and we have deliberately entitled our panel to be about cyber operations to enable each of our panelists in their opening remarks to highlight their current operational focus areas and critical priorities for cyber operations, which are likely to be simultaneously similar and different across the sea services and the National Mission Force. And we'll start with Admiral Gilday. Over to you.
Good morning. I'd like to begin by thanking the Navy League for putting on yet another great Sea or Space Symposium, and for all of you for coming together to join us this morning, hopefully with some good questions. If I could just kind of lay the blueprint out of the Navy in terms of the course that we're on, I would go back about a year and a half to the strategy that Admiral Tighe put together. And that strategy is really grounded on three pillars within information warfare. And those three pillars are assured command and control, battle space awareness, and integrated fires. And so across those three pillars, we have a community of officers and enlisted that touch everything from cryptology and intelligence to communications and networks to meteorology. What Admiral Tighe did across those three pillars is line out 5 strategic objectives. And those strategic objectives are really grounded on developing and maturing a force that can execute and remain competitive into the future. The strategy is consistent with SecDef's cyber strategy. It also nests very well with C&O's design for maritime superiority. And I hope we get into this a little bit deeper this morning, but we essentially operate across 3 domains, if you will. The first is the electromagnetic spectrum, the second is cyberspace, and the third is space. Those 3 domains being interdependent. And it's not really where they begin or they end, but actually where they converge. And harnessing the power of that, both in terms of supporting the UCP missions under Admiral Rogers for cyber, and that's defensive networks, and also delivering of effects in and through cyberspace, but also for the United States Navy in supporting our distributed maritime operations and C&O's vision for new fleet design. So that's our blueprint, and that's been our focus of executing the strategy that Admiral Tighe put together, and I look forward to getting deeper into it this morning.
Thanks, Mike. And over to you, General Reynolds.
Thank you, ma'am. Good morning, everybody. And I, too, would like to thank the Navy League for hosting this. This is always a great event. You know, it seems like, last time I was sitting here, it's hard to believe it's been a year already. So we are in a time of fascinating change, I think, in the cyberspace domain. I've been in command now for a couple years, and I have never been in a command where things have happened so fast, and we have matured processes so fast. We have grown the force so quickly. So it's been a tremendous opportunity and honor to be able to be a part of this right now. Inside the Marine Corps, we have 3 lines of effort at Marine Forces Cyber. The first, and my first priority, is to secure, operate, and defend the Marine Corps network, right? So Admiral Tighe talked a lot about the various challenges and the threats that we have. So in that line of effort, there's a ton of work that we're doing to flatten and harden our warfighting network, consolidating domains, getting after Win 10 implementation, our IP address management strategies. We just signed a contract to do a comply to connect capability across the network that we're hopeful is going to really help us with the security of the network. All the while working through how do we extend the mix-in into the tactical domain in a defensible way. And so a lot of good work there to really modernize the network and make it more defensible. My second line of effort is to provide warfighting capability in the cyberspace domain, right? So what do we do to provide ready forces to the supported geographic combatant command? And in that line of effort, what we're really working on, aside from the real tactics that is difficult to talk about in this kind of environment, we're working on the manpower piece of it. Building out the standing Joint Force Headquarters that's going to command and control the cyber mission force in support of the combatant commands. And also, I think inside the Marine Corps, what we've learned is that we have to build a cyberspace MOS from a readiness and a retention aspect. How do you keep the teams ready once you've built them, with the length of training and access time and clearances? And so we're going to build the cyberspace MOS. And so we've spent a lot of time in the last 90 days or so to kind of design that in a way that we can very, very quickly get after the cyber MOS. So it's a very exciting time for us in the Marine Corps. And then that last piece that we have, my last line of effort, is providing relevance back into the Marine Corps. So in the last year or so, the Commandant has made it clear that he wants to modernize the Marine Corps to build the 2025 force. And the 2025 force is a force that is able to compete against a peer adversary in the information environment. So we've created new formations. We've changed some formations out in the MAGTF. But how do you bring together cyberspace, just as 10th Fleet is doing? How do you bring together cyberspace, electronic warfare, information operations, command and control, and intelligence functions all together to best support the senior operational commanders out there? We have a path. We have a new Marine Corps structure to get after this, and so it's we're starting to implement that now after a year of designing it. So pretty exciting time, and so we're all pretty busy. So look forward to taking your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, General Reynolds. Admiral White.
Morning, ma'am. Thanks for the opportunity to speak here. I'd also like to thank the Navy League for hosting these sorts of events. I've benefited greatly in my career in being able to participate in various port calls with organizations like the Navy League, and it's always good to be a participant. So I had the great privilege of being the commander of the Cyber National Mission Force, which is a joint headquarters element and an operational force underneath the U.S. Cyber Command. So I partner with all the commanders here on the stage, as well as Army component. They man, train, and equip provision forces, and I had the luxury of 2 things. 1, not owning or operating a network, and 2, getting to do a whole bunch of operational mission planning and execution. And so I have a lot of the fun and relatively little burden. I would be doing a little bit of a disservice. I know that we're here to focus on the maritime services, but as a joint commander, I can tell you one of the things that is a great privilege and a great benefit to me is to understand and see how all of the services participate, train and equip their forces and bring them to the fight. And in every way, it is a healthy competition, right? So General Nakasone at Army Cyber, in the Guard and Reserve in particular, I benefit from having those forces. So that points to something about the human capital and the way that we're going to have to do the workforce going forward, I think, just to make us better. As much as we might like to think about there being Navy bits or Marine Corps bits or Coast Guard bits in cyberspace, as our adversary is teaching us every day, there's just bits. And you've either been hacked or you don't know that you've been hacked. I have 39 teams. I operate them in three sorts of structured presentations: a protection team, a support team, and a mission team. I'll wrap this up pretty quickly. That was an original design from 2013 or so, and I think one of the things that we've learned is we have been chartered by Admiral Rogers to focus on our primary mission, which is defend the nation, and to be aware of what the threats are to the Department of Defense and its operating forces globally, but also to be the sort of lead element inside U.S. Cyber Command to think about mobilizing capacity to defend the nation off DODN. So one of the things that we're wrestling with and getting a better sense of is how do we partner through DHS, through DOD, through DISCA authorities and so on, Coast Guard, to figure out how we can partner with industry sectors to be effective, to build relationships, and so that if called upon, we can operate properly and do regard with the law. One of the ways that we've shifted a little bit over the last couple of years is we've organized our forces to focus on the 4 of the 4+1 that is commonly understood to be those things that the DoD is organizing itself against. And in my case, that would always be the ability of a state actor to generate cyber power as an instrument of power counter to U.S. interests. And so my attentions are squarely focused on Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. And just to sort of talk a little bit briefly about that to set the stage, they have as much access to commercial sector and advanced technology as we do. It's a commercial-driven market. It's a consumer-driven market. You can just ask my daughters in their data plan, which I fund. The pace of change, which I write checks for every 6.5 months or so, as technology shifts, if not faster, is consistent with that, and I have personal experience in that. But my sense of what nations are doing in this space, it's more coordinated, it's more interoperable from their perspective, and it's more structured, and it's more integrated. They are building what I would call campaigns, and they are being very thoughtful about it. They are purposeful in their approach, and there is some design that they are organizing themselves to do, and I think that they are on the field in this space, and we are figuring out how to get on that field. One of the things that I'm interested in engaging with the audience today would be understanding how we move our posture as a nation from being broadly reactive to something where we are doing things as a result of our own campaign and our own planning efforts. But it's a great privilege to be here with you, and thank you for your time today.
Thanks, Admiral White. Admiral Lunday.
Thank you, Vice Admiral Tighe. Thanks to the Navy League for this tremendous event, and thank you all. It's great to see so many familiar faces in the audience. I want to say a special thank you and welcome to our allies and also the members of the maritime industry. Those are relationships and partnerships that we depend on in the Coast Guard, as the other services do, to get our mission done. So thank you for being here as well. For context, as you know, the Coast Guard is one of the 5 armed forces, a military service at all times, but also a federal law enforcement agency and a member of the intelligence community. We're a proud member of the joint force that is positioned in the right place within the Department of Homeland Security. And because of that unique positioning and role and combination of authorities, it makes the Coast Guard a unique instrument of national security. The Commandant has set forth 4 strategies that we are operating under right now. The cyber strategy is one of those strategies, and I'll talk a little bit about that today and look forward to your questions. In 2015, the Commandant released the Coast Guard cyber strategy, and in that he declared that cyberspace was an operational domain. We are just beginning to realize how profound a statement and the implications of that for the service. It's not only a domain because he said it was, that's certainly good enough for us, but it will be an operational domain for the Coast Guard when we have brought over 226 years of operating doctrine, concepts, operational art, and ethos in the maritime domain and over a century of that experience in the aviation world into the cyberspace domain. And we are on the process and path to do that. In the strategy, the Commandant laid out 3 strategic objectives for the Coast Guard. 1, defend cyberspace, defend our networks. Number 2, enable Coast Guard operations by operating in cyberspace. And then number 3, protecting maritime critical infrastructure, our maritime transportation system, which the Coast Guard has unique authorities to do and responsibility to do. As the Commandant set forth that strategy, we have begun, starting late last year after an intense period of analysis and study, to move into execution. So if you think about that strategy and the 3 objectives focusing on the ends, the Coast Guard Cyber Program, which we are now embarking on, describe the ways and means by which we will achieve that strategy. There are 5 lines of effort, and I'll touch on them briefly. The first is to establish the Coast Guard as the leader for cybersecurity in the maritime transportation system for maritime critical infrastructure. Under the leadership of Admiral Paul Thomas and others, we have been working with the maritime industry to build awareness of the risks of threats from cyberspace and our reliance on that domain. We've begun to move into the governance phase, which is pointing and working with industry to align to recognized industry standards for cybersecurity, such as those put out by the National Institute for Science and Technology or by classification societies. And we are understanding, and the maritime industry is beginning to look at those as incorporating those standards into safety management systems, not just security systems for vessels and port facilities. Number 2, we are organizing ourselves for cyberspace operations. We have built inside the service a clear command and control construct with clear relationships between me as the Coast Guard Cyber Commander and our area commanders and their subordinate commanders for how we'll conduct operations in the cyberspace domain. We've centralized the disparate way that we did IT, network operations, and security into an organized network operations and security center under Coast Guard Cyber Command that does operations and defense of all of our networks and systems. And we're creating a cyberspace forces office to do the organize, man, train, and equip functions at the policy and program level and headquarters. One of the most significant things under the organize was the clarification, the cementing of our relationship between DoD and DHS when the Secretaries of Homeland Security and Secretary of Defense signed this last January a memorandum of agreement that clarified that the Coast Guard, our networks are primarily, almost all, are part of the DoD information networks. We are .mil. And that we will align to DoD cybersecurity standards, the standards for the DoD cyberspace workforce, and it lays out how we will conduct operations with DoD and DHS in cyberspace. The third leg is develop and generate a cyberspace workforce, taking a total force approach, active, reserve, civilian, our auxiliary volunteers. People, not technology, are the most important element in this domain, and so we are investing in understanding and developing that workforce. The fourth line of effort is to generate the first operating forces for cyberspace. We began that last month when we began to form a Coast Guard cyber protection team that will be organized, trained, and equipped the same joint standards that the rest of the cyber mission force and DoD are. And I can talk a little bit more about that as we begin to build it. And the last line of effort is to modernize our outdated information systems and infrastructure into an enterprise mission platform, a strategic asset that the organization invests in just as it does other capital assets like cutters, boats, and aircraft, so that we have an enterprise mission platform that is secure, reliable, resilient, and dependable. As the Commandant reminds us, as we operate in cyberspace, just as the other domains, the end result of everything we do is to ensure that Coast Guard men and women who operate in a dangerous and unforgiving maritime environment can get the mission done and return safely. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Admiral Lunday, and thanks for everybody for your opening comments. We're going to move into the question and answer portion of this. I'm going to start with a question for each of the panelists, but there are microphones out in the audience, and if you do have a question, I'd appreciate if you could state your name and organization before you ask your question. And so I'm going to start with Vice Admiral Gilday. You mentioned CNO's design for maritime superiority, and as we well know, the blue line of effort talks about ingraining information warfare and expanding the electromagnetic maneuver warfare concept to include space and cyberspace. As Fleet Cyber Command, you wield directly the cyberspace operations capability and the space operations capability and have a huge role in the electronic warfare aspects of electromagnetic maneuver warfare. Can you talk to us a little bit about the initiatives you've taken on at Fleet Cyber Command, specifically in the cyber line of operation, to ingrain information warfare with our other warfighting domains?
Absolutely. So I'd like to talk about 3 of those domains together, and then I'll focus on cyber a little bit. So in your mind's eye, picture a Venn diagram of 3 circles. The first would be the electromagnetic spectrum. And so for warfighters, that's typically where we would consider electronic warfare, both offensive, defensive, and support. Directed energy also falls in that electromagnetic spectrum. Joining that, right next to it, is cyberspace, with defensive and offensive cyber operations. And then joining those 2 circles would be space, with defensive space control and offensive space control. But as I mentioned in my opening remarks, the interesting piece of this isn't where those circles begin or end, it's where they converge. And so the absolute interdependencies between space, let's say, and the electromagnetic spectrum, where those satellites in space aren't worth much unless they're transmitting through the electromagnetic spectrum and using that in order to transmit important information. And so there's not a seam there, but there's actually an interdependency. You can say the same thing about space and cyberspace, and you can say the same thing about the electromagnetic spectrum and cyberspace, and a good example of that would be RF, right, and Wi-Fi. And so for a commander out there, and it doesn't matter what color uniform they're wearing, but to focus on the Navy for a moment, that's important maneuver space. And just as an operational commander controls the command and control of the physical, the platforms, the ships, the aircraft, and the submarines, he or she also controls command and control of the spectrum and the convergence of those spectrum and how to best use it in a warfight. And so I think that in terms of cyber, our focus on both the offensive side and the defensive side, what we are trying to do is to essentially, on the offensive side, make our the plans that we're developing, the targets that we're working on, in some ways make them more relevant to the fleet commander in a naval campaign, and to be able to take advantage of things like access that ships give you in order to exploit the target set. On the defensive side, what we've done is we've expanded from our cyber protection teams, which were really stood up and designed to do both mission assurance operations on our global networks and also to be able to do incident response in case there is a compromise. We have pushed that to the tactical edge, and actually we have deployers with kit aboard our carrier strike groups now. And they can do everything from mission assurance to incident response to forensics if there is a compromise on those ships. So in terms of supporting the CNO's vision for distributed maritime operations across the globe, we are moving quickly into that direction, both from the offensive and the defensive. I'd like to just mention what I consider to be probably the key partnership in this domain, my observation over the past few years. And we have many partners, and we can't do it alone. But more and more, I see the value of industry rising up as the absolute key partner for me moving forward. And I say that from 2 different perspectives. One is in terms of the threat. And so a few minutes ago, Admiral White essentially mentioned that the nation-state threats out there not only point at .mil, but they also point at .gov, and they point at .com. And so if you want to have cyber SA across what's going on in cyberspace, we can't just look at .mil. Those actors are as active in .com and .gov. And so understanding what's going on in industry in terms of how you're dealing with those adversaries, and likewise, you're understanding how we're dealing with those same adversaries, can be pretty powerful if we become more transparent and work to mature that partnership along the threat line. Separately, innovation is really key to anything in this domain, particularly cyber. And so the speed of innovation is a daily change of better mousetrap. And those better mousetraps are being produced by industry. And industry is solving problems in legacy networks across our country that look a lot like the same problems we have within .mil. They are very similar networks, similar adversaries, similar problems. The turn cycle for innovative products within industry meets a demand signal that we have. And so that's why I've come to view industry, and I don't just say that because many of you out there, I say it because I believe it is a critical partner in helping us in cyber, in the electromagnetic spectrum, and in space.
Thank you, Admiral Gilday. General Reynolds, you spoke a little bit about the Marine Corps looking at organization, and specifically about the organization of information warfare type capabilities. As the commander of MAR4 Cyber, what do you see that in future looking like? Does it imply some change in responsibilities, or do you know yet?
Ma'am, I think I don't think it will change the responsibility at Marine Forces Cyber. I think it will augment our Marine capability. So, for instance, we have repurposed an existing organization out in the MAGTF that, in fact, I used to command the MEF headquarters group. And when I commanded the MEF headquarters group, I had 5 subordinate battalions that belonged to the MEF commander, but it was the intelligence battalion, the radio battalion, the communication battalion, and a couple other military police. What we've done with that command is we are turning that into the MEF information group. So all of the time that I spent, with the care and feeding of the MEF staff, and we're going to offload that to combat service support, and we're going to allow that 06 commander at the MEF to focus on fighting the information battle for the MEF commander. So giving that commander real capability and talent to be able to integrate electronic warfare and information operations and cyber defense. So we're building, in much the same way that the Navy has the defensive cyber aboard ship, we're going to build defensive cyber into the MEF, into our communication battalions, but they would be tasked by the MEF information group. And so that is help for us, right? So of the service-oriented CPTs that I command and control now, it's not sufficient to do a couple things out there. Number one, to cover down on the network, the weapon systems, the PII repositories, all of those things that we think we need to get out and touch and feel. So these would be defensive cyber forces that would be oriented on the MEF assets. So we do think that we will have to command and control those in some way, and at least coordinate their activities on the network. But this is just greater capability at the tactical edge that we can't build those fast enough.
Great. Yes, ma'am. Okay, thanks, General Reynolds. Admiral White, you mentioned that you are not burdened by operating or defending a service network. And in the same breath, you described your responsibility as defending the nation. So that seems like a burden, particularly when it's defense of networks that you don't own or operate. You also talked about partnerships. Could you talk a little bit more in depth about the importance of partnerships and where they exist in order for you to meet the requirement to respond, as a DoD element to attacks against our nation in cyberspace?
Yes, ma'am. So I think a couple things just to sort of frame that. As I mentioned, as a joint commander, I have the privilege of operating, commanding, leading, and partnering and working with all the services as they present the forces. And so I have to figure out a way to sort of amalgamate and make coherent sort of different service cultures. And I would say, you know, the U.S. Air Force seems to bring, I think, what they would characterize as a weapons systems approach to a lot of what they do. So a lot of the kit that I use, that they present to me, and a lot of the infrastructure that they operate globally, for example, an AOC is sort of built to what they would call a weapons system standard. I see value in the way that works from a programmatic standpoint, but that can be sometimes difficult to operate and plug into with commercial off-the-shelf capability, which a lot of our kit is built out of. The U.S. Army, I think, brings sort of a small unit, scalable all the way up to division and Army Corps as a perspective, and they bring an ability to think from the very, very small tactical to the very, very large and a great distance. You know, I think the Marines, all in, all the time, the very best at the tactical development, then an ability to plug and play in a very expeditionary way in an extraordinarily joint capacity. The Coast Guard, ever present, safety, resilient, oriented, and the ability for us as we look at it in the uniformed services to be the example by which we interact with civil society and domestic law enforcement, which we rarely typically do on the uniform side. And then from a Navy standpoint, platform, overseas, very far away, distributed lethality, great distance, and trying to establish control. So I have forces that come to me, soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marine and Coast Guardsmen, and civilian, that come out of that service bias. What I'm trying to do in our forces is reduce the distance in every way that I can between offense and defense. We are better together if they inform each other, and between intel and operations. And then the way we do that can only be done with the cadre that we have. So I think what I really need from industry are sort of a couple things. I need a very good persistent cyber training environment. I need the ability to sort of build a cyber dojo or something that looks like that, that I can put with Marines in the field, Coast Guard cutters, strike groups at sea, deployed forces with the Army, and I can wire tie them through good spectrum management and a global presence, and they can hone their skills. I need it to be scalable. I need it to be adaptable to a very dynamic and fast-moving threat. The more realism and fidelity, and agility that we can provide in that, that would be one of the single things that we could probably do the very best at. And that would, frankly, in my opinion, raise everybody's game, because that's a mechanism by which that you can share information with industry at the right level, some of it classified, much of it open source, and everybody that's in the operate and defend business in promoting resiliency in industry can benefit from that. I think the partnership that Admiral Gilday talked about is going to be vital. One of the things that industry, at least in my reading, seem to do is you guys are in the competition business, right? In order to become and then stay a going concern, you have that sense of competition in ways that perhaps we traditionally, historically, don't. The uniformed services do that. We haven't typically viewed armed conflict as a competition. We viewed it as an armed conflict. But I do think that as we learn from you and some of the principles that you have in organization and aligning, there are some interesting things about learning from you how to be more competitive with our workforce. And then I think it's about the workforce. We need to figure out a way for us to identify young talent and for them to go and come back and maybe go again and come back again. And to do that to industry, to academia, into the policy world, into the private sector, and so that they can have a genuine, 5-decade plus career, a national security career in cybersecurity. So.
Great. Thank you very much. Admiral Lunday, in your dual roles as both a commander of forces for Cyber Command and a director on the staff for the Commandant, it occurs to me, especially after listening to him talk many times, that you report to a very informed Commandant when it comes to cyberspace. And we heard Admiral Michelle yesterday on the Vice panel also talking very articulately about the threats and how Coast Guard is thinking about cyber. But you're also part of that joint force every day operating as part of U.S. Cyber Command. Can you talk about how you balance those responsibilities to both the Coast Guard and being part of a joint force?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for the question. So I think in some ways our challenge is similar to the other services. We have service responsibilities reporting up to the Commandant as the service chief role. And also, because we are .mil, part of the DODN, and we're under that structure as part of the joint force, in a joint role, I report as a commander of a service cyber component to Admiral Rogers in his role as commander of U.S. Cyber Command, and Lieutenant General Lynn in his role as commander of Joint Force Headquarters DoD Information Networks for the defense, the joint defense of DoD Information Networks, and are part of those networks. I think what makes our challenge a bit different in this way is that the Commandant is not just the service chief, he's also for the Coast Guard a senior operational commander for the service, with operational control over the two area commanders and over Coast Guard Cyber Command, using Coast Guard authorities to conduct operations. And so in that way, as we look at the three objectives or lines of effort I talked about in the strategy, how do we enable Coast Guard operations by integrating operations in cyberspace with operations in air, land, and sea and space in the Coast Guard? And then how do we protect the maritime critical infrastructure? What we needed to have is a clear understanding of command and control construct. There's one thing I learned at 2 years at U.S. Cyber Command is you have to get the command and control right. And so what the Vice Commandant directed last year was we needed one person, Commander Coast Guard Cyber, who has authority, responsibility, and accountability for operation, defense, and networks in a relationship with the area commanders to accomplish all three of those lines of effort, those strategic objectives. And so how we operate in that, under those Coast Guard authorities, has been a bit of a unique challenge for the Coast Guard. Not unique in the sense that it's unique to us. We do that in other domains all the time. But let me give you an example. If we have a sector commander on a coastal area who has authorities as the captain of the port, as the Federal Maritime Security Coordinator, and they have an incident in that port that impacts maritime critical infrastructure. And part of that incident that has physical consequences, let's say in this case it has a cyber element to it. There's a part of it involves a cyber intrusion or a cyber attack. That sector commander needs the ability to reach back to Commander Coast Guard Cyber and perhaps in the cyber protection team that we're building out to provide expertise as that sector commander manages the incident, working with the interagency, with the maritime industry to manage that incident in the port that impacts maritime critical infrastructure. They also need the ability for Coast Guard Cyber to reach back to Department of Homeland Security and its operational teams and authorities, as well as other agencies, and back to the Joint Force. If the consequence, if the event is of such magnitude, it's a major destructive or disruptive attack, it may trigger the authorities of the Secretary of Defense to defend the nation. And I may need to reach back through the system, through Admiral Rogers, to Admiral White and his team in their defend the nation role. So having those relationships and command and control constructs within the service and with our partners is essential to our ability to carry out those missions.
Great, thank you. Well, we have opportunity for questions from the audience. I do see someone standing over to my left.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Patrick Tucker with Defense One. Quick question for Admiral White. In terms of these campaigns that you see, first I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about them, and specifically, do you see these adversarial nations using emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence to improve either the effectiveness or the pacing of those campaigns? And slightly narrower, do you see them keeping a human in the loop at all times in the use of offensive cyber weapons? Thank you very much.
Yeah, so those are very, very good questions, and I would tell you my ability to answer them to any detail is pretty constrained and limited. So let me just, broadly say that, one of the things that we've seen great value as a joint force is sort of, promoting thinking and then a disciplined approach to the application of that force. And the best way to do that is out of an organized and structured campaign, where you identify in pretty discrete and pretty emphatic terms about what your objectives are, and then the necessary resources to achieve them. And then you put that in the context of, timeline, and then you adhere resources to that, you mobilize the effort, and then you go about executing those subordinate operations and lines of effort. They are not something that happens as a discrete case. It's not just a single mission at a single point in time at a single place. It is something that is, interleaved and woven together to achieve a national purpose. And so when I say that the things that we see occurring to us, I think, in the .mil domain, and I would say, .gov, and I would presume that many in this space in their capacity with industry would say that they're subject to something that looks like a persistent presence. We hear an awful lot about this term advanced persistent threat. I've heard recently from a couple different speakers in various venues that to your question about AI and other advanced technologies, the thing which sort of characterizes an APT is really less about being advanced necessarily and more about being persistent. I don't know that I would say we've seen particularly new, exquisite, or sort of, DARPA-like capabilities yet, but I do think that it will be inevitable because it's accessible. And that's one of the great levelers in cyberspace. By being connected, you are fundamentally not constrained by physics, you are only constrained by your imagination. And they are just as imaginative and bold and audacious as we aspire to be.
Thanks, TJ. And Patrick, that was a very thoughtful question. I think it links a little bit to one of the questions you asked last night, which was, how have we seen cyber operations change in the last 5 or so years? And I think your answer to a question that was asked last night was perhaps better than mine was, which is to say that it appears to be part of deliberate campaigns, not targets of opportunities, not random, but deliberate campaigns that are being carried out that we may not actually see the full picture of at any given moment. So thanks for that question. Does that answer it, Patrick?
I think so, thanks.
Thank you. We've got a question on this side.
Good morning, Admiral. Lieutenant Commander Anderson, Netsafa, Pensacola. Building upon the Admiral White and Admiral Gilday's comments about international cyber efforts and CPTs as well as training, I have a question about how you see the future of U.S. support to our foreign military partners. As our adversaries become more adept at hacking and infiltrating our networks and their networks, our partners also become more vulnerable to these attacks. So what do you see as the future of U.S. support for training for our foreign national partners to effectively operate within the cyber domain?
Admiral Gilday, you want to take the start?
So it's just growing. So beyond the Five Eyes partners, which we've had a very mature relationship and robust relationship for years. In fact, the Navy just finished up an exercise 2 nights ago, a cyber exercise with the Brits, a maritime exercise. We work very closely with the Australians. We also work very closely with partners like the Japanese and the Philippines. And so partners that we have in the Pacific, for example, that we rely upon. And so I think that over time, the depth and scope of those exercises is just going to increase. But we're in beginning stages, and I think in a very good place. There's a lot of interest. There's certainly a heavy demand signal. And our force just started building in 2013. And so we are taking on as much as we can. We see the value of it, and I just see it continuing to grow.
Yeah. General Reynolds, anything from the Marine
I would just add Canada to that list. I mean, they participated in Cyber Flag as just another one of the teams that. This is just a fascinating domain of warfare where we went from build the force to do interagency coalition ops in the span of a year. It's been fun to watch.
I appreciate the question. I mean, clearly we're not going to fight alone. And if cyber is going to be a part of that, we've got to have all the partners need to be able to share information and fight together in the domain of cyberspace as well. So I think that's a continuing opportunity as we move forward.
Could I just add one follow-on to that? And so if I reflect on, as a surface warfare officer, typically we really need to have ships, we really need to be interoperable with other navies in terms of working together. And in cyber, everybody brings different capabilities to the table. And we can leverage those, as Admiral White said, in very creative ways. And the other thing that you can leverage is authorities. And so each country has a different take on authorities and in terms of how far they're delegated, in terms of how broad they are. And so working together, you can do some pretty creative, some pretty impactful things, leveraging each other in the right way.
So strength through diversity.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. A question on this side?
Hi, Galen Spaywar. Has our recent focus on force structure been at the expense of getting additional C4ISR capability? And 2, what does force structure mean in the cyber domain? Is it like trained soldiers behind a computer, or
Okay, that's probably for me.
Yes, ma'am.
I would say absolutely not. The focus on force structure, and clearly you heard CNO talk about the fact that we have done a lot of thoughtful review of the force that we think we will need to answer the call that our nation, is asking of us. But I think the Navy leadership is also very, very sensitive and attuned to the fact that our network infrastructure, our cyber capabilities, our cyber resiliency is an absolutely essential piece of that warfighting capability. So it's not just about the, counting individual ships, aircraft, and submarine. We need to be able to do that, and we need to be able to do that so that combatant commanders can plan with those capabilities. But for us, having those resilient defenses and offering opportunities, creating opportunities for offensive effects is something that we've got to be able to do and provide so that the combatant commanders can plan for them and so that we can put on a vibrant defense. I think you've heard from the panelists that our capabilities principally reside in our humans. I'll steal from the commandant, we equip our cyber warriors with tools. And those are tools from industry, and those are capabilities that are developed over time to be able to deliver effects. And so how we define capacity in cyberspace has a lot to do with the human capacity that we have, but we are also being very thoughtful on the defensive side in terms of assessing our own vulnerabilities and creating standards by which program managers and capability developers can build new classes of ships, build new platforms, build new capabilities, build new C4I systems to the standards that our technical authority at SPAWAR is working. And that technical authority works across all of our service systems commands so that the architectural standards that have to be built in to make our systems resilient are being adhered to and are being followed. So that roadmap is critical in building future systems, and that's our approach as you likely know, coming from SPAWAR.
If I could just expound on that a little bit for the Coast Guard, we face the same challenge in terms of how do we prioritize investment in the technology, the enterprise mission platform that I talked about, versus the human capital piece. It's not different than how we face that challenge with other capital assets. I was just underway last week on the Coast Guard cutter James, one of our national security cutters, after an incredibly successful patrol in the Eastern Pacific against transnational criminal organizations. And it is an amazing platform. We are pushing the boundaries of what we imagined it could do for the nation. But you can take that amazing platform and you can paint a Coast Guard racing stripe and put U.S. Coast Guard on the side. But it doesn't become a Coast Guard cutter until you put the crew on board. That's what makes it a Coast Guard cutter. And it's the same for our technology, our network, our infrastructure, our enterprise mission platform. We've got to invest in the people, as Admiral White described, and challenge some traditional notions of how we manage that workforce from a human capital strategy standpoint. But it's got to be a coordinated investment in both parts of that to make it work.
Thank you.
Thanks.
In the middle.
Richard Wu, Naval Surface Warfare Center, Carter Rock Division. It's a long name. So my question is, just about an hour ago at the congressional breakfast, one of the key points that was given to us was that time and resources are very limited. So the question that I have is, what can we prioritize from an acquisition standpoint to continue growing our capabilities as effectively as possible?
Good question.
It's a good question for the operational committee.
I'll take a stab at it. So I think in terms of innovation, right, I think that we're really in phase 2. In phase 1, in cyber with respect to innovation had everything to do with closing gaps and seams, with closing vulnerabilities, with kind of putting a finger in the dike of vulnerabilities that we found and networks that had not been designed to keep pace with an evolving, more lethal threat. And so what we see now in terms of innovation, I think, and what I would call phase two, is that we're going beyond that, and industry is actually developing capabilities that get ahead, that try and keep pace with, and hopefully get ahead of the threat, leveraging, all the subsets of AI, right? Cognitive computing and machine learning, deep learning. And so I think in terms of priorities, I think that's what we're really looking at in terms of defending our networks. I think what becomes difficult is to try and find the right product that you can scale, that you can sustain, that you can build off of in what we all have responsibilities for global networks.
I think his answer's spot on. It's cyber is intelligence driven. Whether you're talking about the offensive or whether you're talking about the defense, anything that we can do to automate the intelligence cycle, the data analytics, to get the teams on target, to get the defenders in the right spot, and to make sense of the volumes of data that we have available to us, that's the right investment.
I think industry will be the key here. One of the things that I grew up believing I understood about DoD was that for the nation, it very often, certainly in post-Cold War, for the next probably 3+ decades, led the way in terms of pure research spending, and then converting that into something that looked like applied science, applied engineering, and then outcomes, to the fleet or to the Air Force or the Marines or Coast Guard and Army. That's not the case anymore. So in a constrained budget, you all are already in that space of innovation and thinking about data mining and data science and big data solutions. The cost of memory is going down, the cost of compute's going down, speeds are going up, and accelerating data sources, and the ingest rate is expanding at incredible paces. You will find ways to get insight into that data in ways that maybe we don't appreciate. So with that partnership, we will gain that insight. The thing that government can do, I think, is General Reynolds talked about, is take advantage of the intelligence cycle. Being adaptive and agile and understanding what the security concerns and protocols are, being able to exchange that information will go a long way. I hear an awful lot about artificial intelligence. I can't take credit for my next comment, but I heard it somewhere from some other smart people that while we ought to be concerned about that, we probably ought to be more concerned about natural stupidity. And that's one of the things I think we really need to fight as an organization. We need to learn about our people. And I think that's a great observation, that a Coast Guard cutter doesn't become a cutter no matter what color you paint it until you put the crew on board. That's going to be the same for a Navy ship or for a Marine Corps unit. So that will be our future.
And from the acquisition perspective, I would just add that everything that the commanders talked about from the Navy staff perspective, we've instituted processes whereby we look for opportunities for rapid prototyping in areas that we have gaps. Cyber defense would be one of them, human machine teaming, AI, using the big data analytics, and then advanced accelerated acquisition capabilities. That sense of urgency that CNO talks about in terms of competition and needing to get to a better place sooner is what we're looking to be able to rapidly prototype if it needs prototyping, or do accelerated acquisition on it to be able to instantiate it across the force with a sustainable tail, with training, with everything that we need to be able to take full advantage of those capabilities. Let's try one here.
Thank you, ma'am. Colonel Paul Muller, U.S. Naval War College. I'm not a techie. My question deals more with the piece that keeps coming up, starting with the vice chiefs yesterday about the criticality of recruiting and retaining the absolute right sailors, Marines, Coast Guardsmen and for our partners in the Army and the Air Force as well. Yesterday during the innovation panel, the second Sea Lord referred to what he called non-standard recruiting, particularly in the light of how the UK is now recruiting cyber warriors. They are waiving virtually all of what we think of as typical military requirements: no uniforms, no haircuts, thick eyeglasses, no weight limits. This would require a major cultural shift, especially for us Marines. But is it time for us to, as we look at embracing other forms of diversity in the hopes of becoming stronger as a force, is it time to bring this non-standard recruiting approach to our cyber force? And if not, why not?
I'll take a shot at it.
Thank you, ma'am.
First off, the second Sea Lord is such a cool title. I think we should.
That was cool.
We need some Sea Lords around. You guys are just admirals. So, the Commandant keeps asking me this, Paul. He keeps saying, do they have to have purple hair and, nose rings? And the answer is no, they don't have to. What we have found is that from a recruiting perspective, we're not having any trouble finding the right folks out there that can do this job, and they want to do this job. I do think that if we try to grow the force, the eligible population across our country is shrinking. It's shrinking. And so, when you add, certainly the Marine standard, you add to that the top secret clearance, squeaky clean record, maybe there is an opportunity for us to kind of look at other ways, kind of the Marine Corps band model, where you bring in these gifted musicians, and you make them staff sergeants, and then they spend their years in the White House in a red uniform, but they're Marines, right? So we're going to look for everything. We're going to look at all those models. The one thing that I will say is that I think, when you heard Admiral White talk about the culture that every team brings to the fight, one of the things that our teams bring to the fight is the fact that they are warfighters. They are Marines first. They understand the MAGTF. They understand combined arms. They understand how to, target and to stay on target and to pursue in cyberspace. They understand that. And so, first do no harm, right? So we don't want to do anything that changes the culture of first being a Marine, then a rifleman, then a cyberspace warrior. And so we have to balance those. But I think we're going to open up, we're going to look for every opportunity that we can to get the right talent in seats.
Admiral Gilday.
Yeah, just quickly, I'd be very cautious about changing our standards. I think they've served us well for a long time. I think, one of the thoughts that I have is that in 10th Fleet, for example, we have a really healthy mix of military and civilian. And so you don't have to wear a uniform to play in this game and to contribute. And so maybe we should think about that. One of the initiatives that Admiral Tighe, it's just been great to follow in her shadow in this job and leverage so much of the good work that she's done. And one of the things that she did is she initiated a study on a university to take a look at a cyber aptitude battery that we can essentially give to the force that we have and find out where that talent resides. And I'm not talking about specific STEM skill sets or coding skill sets, but the aptitude to do this work. And so you can make the argument that we potentially have not leveraged as much as we can inside the Navy or inside the services. And when you take a look at the importance of cyber, and we've talked about it all morning, the numbers across the force that work in this line of business are very small comparatively, and so that probably has to grow.
And I would say for the Coast Guard, we also agree that changing the standards is not the right answer, but we've got to challenge some of the fundamental assumptions about how we manage human capital. It's not specific to cyber. We see increasing specialization across our force on the military and the civilian side. So we look at things that are coming along, like for military personnel, the blended retirement system, which increases the potential for portability. So how do we structure our human capital system to increase those off-ramps, like Admiral White described, where someone can come in and serve for a period of time, perhaps even at different levels, and then go back out to the private sector, and then come back in. So we can see the ability to move in and out with more permeability between government, public service, the military, and the private sector. And that benefits both of those communities. So it requires us to challenge some of those assumptions that are out there now. And I don't think we have a long way to go to get there, but we've got to take a close look at them. And we've got to continue to create the incentives that get people interested in service in the military and in public service. One example we've taken for recruiting in the officer corps, about 50% of our officers in the Coast Guard come from out of the academy. We are creating, the other service academies have done this. The Coast Guard is moving with the class of 22 to create a cyber systems major. That increases our ability to attract people who may not have thought about the Coast Guard before. And this year we are graduating all of our ensigns from the academy go first into operational assignments. This year, for the first time in our history of the service, we will send 2 ensigns to Coast Guard Cyber as an operational assignment. So we can use those steps in managing our workforce to also recruit people so that they understand they have an opportunity to pursue interests in ways they may not have been able to before. But we've got to get at challenging some of those assumptions about how we manage the workforce without compromising the standards.
Well said, Admiral Lunday. And I think certainly within the Navy and the Chief of Naval Personnel has been looking at a lot of different and new ways to consider our human capital strategy. And I think we, as you suggest, we're a half a step from being able to implement those types of things. Question on this side.
Good morning. Good morning to the panel, and thank you for what you do, because what you do is not just critical, it's essential to the future of this nation. My name is Everett Hayes, and I am a retired commander. I'm a member of SAS consulting team. Throughout the comments that I've listened to the leaders from all of the services, and then this morning at the congressional breakfast, one of the things that they talk about is the fear of a CR. And I know that your world changes a lot faster than we can build ships or submarines or anything like that. But what would happen, what would be the greatest impact to you and the cyber forces if we have a CR, and what is your contingent plan to address that great impact?
Okay, I'll start. From the service perspective, clearly the CR and a CR and how it affects the rest of the year's budget will have to be adjudicated and allocated across the entire Navy. And so in a lot of cases, and what we've seen in past years gone by with sequestration is, we've had a tremendous effect on our ability to move sailors between jobs, on our ability to hire civilians or incentivize. So in the pipeline, as Admiral Gilday talked about, we've got an awful lot of critical civilian positions in the cyber mission force and in cyber operations in general. And so any uncertainty in budgets immediately, kind of constricts our ability to keep bringing that talent in. And it's pretty devastating. It took us a very long time from the 2013 timeframe to recover from that. It affected training, it affected our civilian recruitment, and it affected our ability to move sailors and officers around inside the Navy. So anything on your thoughts?
Yes, ma'am. I think, inside, my budget, it really just reduces your flexibility to kind of move forward. You're kind of stuck in, sustaining the current budget that you have without being able to, advance new concepts, new programs, R&D, those kinds of things. We're just kind of stuck in, maintain the status quo, and it reduces your agility, really, to use money as a resource. New contracts for, whether it's, for subject matter expertise inside my Marine Corps Cyber Operations Group, which is our network operations center. I mean, so it's just, instead of being able to drive and move in a nimble way, you're kind of stuck in a little bit of uncertainty, and you're managing risk instead of, being able to execute a plan that you'd like to execute. So and then, when you do get the money at the end, it's, you're spending as fast as you can in a responsible way. We have to balance that. We got to get to a budget-driven, using money as a resource that we can, employ effectively across 12 months of execution. And, it's difficult. It makes it very difficult to do things the way you really want them to do.
Mm-hmm. We talk about speed and execution. For the competitive environment that we're in, this is not the way a competitive organization behaves. If you don't have the certainty of those investments we may want to make for rapid prototyping, or the things that we had intended to start as new start systems or capabilities in the cyber domain, gets kicked down the can, it's not a good way to run our services. Question on this side.
I think he gets to go first.
Okay.
Good morning. Lieutenant Commander Regadio with OpNav N80. The cost of entry into a cyber threat capability is very low. For example, cyber hackers. All you need is a computer and an internet connection. Yet we spend billions of dollars on cyber resiliency, fixing cyber vulnerabilities, and cyber assurance. We're on the losing end of this cost curve. How do we get around that, and is it sustainable?
I think that one's for me as well. And we'll have a talk when I get back to the Pentagon. No, I'm just teasing. No, our need, when you talk about being on the losing end of the cost curve, what we're talking about in building cyber resiliency into our weapon systems and platforms is to make sure that the investment we've made in those very platforms is a good investment. If, as you suggest, low cost of entry, if someone can mission kill one of our platforms because of lack of cyber resiliency in them, and we can't accomplish our mission, then it's not the cyber resiliency investment that was the problem, it's the whole investment that was the problem. And so I think our Navy leadership has recognized the necessity to assure our missions by making sure that we are resilient to those type of cyber attacks. So today, we are taking a look at our mission risk across all of our Navy maritime capabilities and working the plan to ensure that they're cyber resilient. The future is about those standards that we talked about and building future systems with the idea that cyber risk is a very valid risk to maritime operations. And so, we're sort of in the catch-up game with the fleet and the systems that we have, many of which may or may not have had a plan to be modernized. But as they modernize, we increase the resiliency and we put those planned capabilities to a defensible standard into those systems. Moving into the future, we build that from the ground floor using standards that can go into a request for proposal and can be measured as part of the operational tests and evaluation. Anybody want to add anything to that?
So I just add, I think we're moving out very quickly with things like engine recompete, right? To bring together OCONUS and CONUS networks to consolidate and to make them more easily defendable. I think we're going in the right steps with the joint regional security stacks. And I think we're going the right way with cloud technologies. And so we are doing stuff with legacy networks to give us more resiliency, but we're also expanding pretty quickly into new areas and taking advantage of some pretty innovative technologies.
Now.
All right. Thanks, Admiral. All right, good morning, and thank you for your time. My name's Matt Tate. I'm with Accenture Federal Services, and I run our defense and national security practice. So my question is more from a cultural perspective. When I look at the Coast Guard, the Navy, the Marine Corps, each of you has a distinct culture. Each of you has civilians, enlisted officers. And from a security perspective, when we talk about cybersecurity, how are each of you thinking about that and dealing with that within each of your organizations when you think of, an E2 who just got out of boot camp, who wants to have his iPhone connected to your network versus your peer group and, everything in between, to have the same focus that we're talking about here on the panel this morning?
I can give that a shot. You know, it is a challenge, right? So this is the most connected generation that, you know, we've ever had, right? But we've got commanders now, and certainly the Commandant's guidance to his senior leadership has been, you know, you got to be really careful about where we allow these Marines to carry these phones. And so I work in a skiff, so my guidance is pretty clear, but you know, if you're the mechanic on the airfield, you know, should you have your iPhone down there and in an environment that may or may not have Wi-Fi or so forth? So commanders are making decisions to say, okay, leave your phone in your car, right? And you know, when your phone, you know, has, all of them have GPS, we have to start thinking about operational security across the Navy Marine Corps team. We have to think about what does that phone have on it that the adversary, you know, that we're all dealing with would find it incredibly enlightening, right? And so it's teaching that kind of operational kind of impact of individual actions that I think we got to start all over, right? Because we've ignored it for too long, I think. But certainly this commandant, he understands it better than most. And so you got commanders right now who are saying, all right, let's start thinking more about operational security here at home. And so I think that's really how you start getting everybody into the right mindset. And that's kind of the way the Marine Corps is starting to attack it. If that answers your question.
I think the Coast Guard's taking a similar approach. You know, when we want Coast Guardsmen who sit down in front of what looks like a computer at work to understand that's not a computer like the one they have at home. It's a part of the enterprise mission platform. It's an operational asset because it truly is, just like it would be a small boat or a cutter that they sit down in front of. So it is about changing that culture and how they think about it. Part of the challenge also, and this gets back to the Commandant's statement in our strategy, that for the Coast Guard cyberspace is an operational domain. We still are trying to understand the implications of that, and here's how I think about it, and we're trying to get others to think about it as well. If we think about aviation, airspace, I mean, man first took to the air in 1903 when the Wright brothers flew with a powered flight, with the help of some Coast Guardsmen at a local surf station, by the way, part of our history. But it didn't become an operational domain until World War I, when pilots began to use it for reconnaissance. They began to drop bricks and then grenades and shoot with pistols at other pilots and then mount machine guns and synchronize them with the propellers. The moment aviation became a domain of human interaction and conflict and warfare, it became an operational domain. Cyberspace is that same way for the United States as well, and for our allies, and for the Coast Guard. And we need to think of it that way. It's not just a difficult engineering problem that we have, and it is, to operate and manage networks and technology and information. There are human beings on the other side of that, or in that space, that we work with and cooperate with, our allies, our partners, and that we are in conflict with. And so we have to get everyone in the service to think of it in that way, to bring that same ethos into this domain.
Yeah, and I think I would just add, building on these comments, the other approach that we've taken here is sort of that building the culture of accountability. And that accountability runs all the way through the Navy. You think about the commander of a DDG, giving that commander the tools to understand what the cyber risk is there and building that culture, how that affects the risk to her mission at any given time, is something that we've tried to empower, the fleet with, so that they have some sense of risk and some sense of what they can do to close gaps, to patch things, to not allow connections to systems that are inappropriate, to kind of drive that behavior. I think we have time for one more question. How about far side? Yes, no, yes.
Wow, that's lucky. My name is Cameron Ayler. I'm a contractor with DTRA. And in the context of this cyber panel, can you comment on the future of transoceanic critical infrastructure and its importance to your command C2?
No.
Yeah, I agree with everything you just said. I don't think we can get into that one too deeply.
It's critical.
Yeah, it's critical.
But it was a very insightful and thoughtful question. Thank you for that. Transoceanic critical infrastructure is critical to our economic well-being, right, as a nation. So, you know, we are a subset of that, but as a nation, it's incredibly, you know, important. Our economy travels across it, and that's where our dependencies are. So probably our command and control through it is a minor subset of the risk that exists in that space. Okay, so thank you for your time today, and I think you know, the multiple questions that we had, very, very good questions, are a reflection of how important this conversation is. I want you to know that we do have the Information Warfare Pavilion here again this year. If you go in down on the floor, it's in the far right back corner, beautiful view. And we have a speaker series in there. We have capabilities that you can take a look at, and we have a series of different speakers that you are welcome to interact with from across our leadership. This afternoon, in fact, Admiral Norton will be hosting a cybersecurity panel with the chief engineers from each of the systems commands. So that could be a very important conversation to hear this afternoon. So thank you for your time and attendance.